Ladies and gentlemen, I am Hercule Poirot, and I solve mysteries. Welcome back to another case.
It was on a particularly dreary Tuesday morning in November that the curious affair which I have come to call "The Man Who Locked Himself In and Still Died" first came to our attention. I remember the date precisely, the 15th, because I had been attempting to balance my household accounts when the familiar measured tread upon our stairs announced the arrival of my friend Hercule Poirot. He entered our sitting room with his customary precision, removing his gloves with the methodical care of a surgeon preparing for an operation. His small, egg-shaped head was tilted slightly to one side, and I recognized at once the expression of intense concentration that indicated his little gray cells were already at work upon some problem. "Hastings, mon ami," he said without preamble, "you have before you a man who has just received the most intriguing telephone call of his career." "Oh?" I set aside my papers, grateful for the interruption. "Another case?" "Possibly. Or perhaps merely another puzzle for the entertainment of Hercule Poirot." He settled himself in his favorite chair and arranged his person with that fussy precision which never failed to amuse me. "Tell me, what would you say to a man who locks himself into a room with no other entrance, no hidden passages, no means of exit save the door through which he entered, and yet is found dead by violence the following morning?" "I should say it was impossible," I replied promptly. "Précisément. And yet, mon ami, such is the problem which has just been presented to me by a most distressed young lady. She will arrive here within the quarter hour, and I confess myself eager to hear her tale in full." I leaned forward with interest. "What did she tell you on the telephone?" "Ah, but the voice, Hastings. Terror controlled by breeding, desperation masked by good manners. She spoke of her employer, a Mr. Cornelius Blackwood of Blackwood Manor in Surrey, found dead this morning in his private study. The door was locked from within, the windows secured, the chimney too narrow for passage. Yet someone, or something, had driven a paper knife between his shoulder blades with considerable force." "Good heavens! And the police?" "They speak of suicide. Naturellement. But our caller, a Miss Diana Thornfield, Mr. Blackwood's private secretary, she is convinced otherwise, and when a young lady of obvious intelligence telephones Hercule Poirot to discuss the impossible, it is usually because the impossible has, in fact, occurred." Before I could respond, we heard a light, hurried step upon the stairs, followed by a gentle rap at our door. "Entrez," called Poirot, and the door opened to admit a young woman of perhaps 28, whose composed exterior could not quite conceal the strain about her eyes. She was dressed in mourning black, but her clothes were well cut and her manner spoke of good breeding. Her dark hair was arranged with careful simplicity, and her gloved hands betrayed only the slightest tremor as she approached. "Monsieur Poirot? I am Diana Thornfield. I telephoned earlier about Mr. Blackwood." Poirot rose and bowed with old-fashioned courtesy. "Mademoiselle Thornfield, this is my friend Captain Hastings. Pray be seated and tell us your story from the beginning." She accepted the chair I offered and sat very straight, as though discipline alone kept her from collapse. "Mr. Blackwood was a difficult man," she began without preamble. "Wealthy, reclusive, and deeply suspicious of everyone around him. Yesterday evening he dined with his usual small circle, his nephew Gerald, who stands to inherit the estate, his business partner, Mr. Edmund Carstairs, and his ward, young Miss Lucy Fairfax. I was present as well in my capacity as secretary." "And the evening passed without incident?" Poirot inquired gently. "Not entirely. Mr. Blackwood seemed agitated, more so than usual. He spoke repeatedly of settling old scores and mentioned that he had discovered something that would shock them all. At 10 o'clock, he announced his intention to work late in his study and was not to be disturbed under any circumstances." "His custom?" "Yes, precisely. He would lock himself in and often work until the early hours. This morning, when he failed to appear for breakfast, his valet tried the door, It was locked as expected, but there was no response to repeated knocking. Finally, we were obliged to force the door. She paused, pressing her lips together firmly. We found Mr. Blackwood slumped over his desk, with a silver paper knife protruding from his back. The room was exactly as he had left it. Windows latched from within, no sign of struggle, nothing disturbed. Yet he was quite dead, and the weapon could not possibly have been self-inflicted given its position. Poirot's eyes had grown very bright. And the others, how did they react to this discovery? Gerald seemed genuinely shocked, though he has always been rather theatrical. Mr. Carstairs appeared more concerned with the business implications than with grief. As for Miss Fairfax, she hesitated. She fainted, but I noticed she had taken care to fall away from the desk, as though she had no wish to see the body too closely. "Most illuminating," murmured Poirot. "And you, mademoiselle, why are you so certain this was not suicide?" Miss Thornfield met his gaze steadily. "Because, Monsieur Poirot, I knew Mr. Blackwood's nature. He was far too proud, too vindictive to take his own life. If he had enemies, and he had many, he would have faced them. He would never have given them the satisfaction of his death by his own hand." Poirot was silent for a long moment, his fingers steepled before him. "Mademoiselle," he said at last, "you present me with a problem that is either completely impossible or utterly simple. In my experience, it is usually the latter. Captain Hastings and I will accompany you to Surrey by the next train." As Miss Thornfield departed with visible relief, I turned to my friend with curiosity. "You seem remarkably confident, Poirot." He smiled that enigmatic smile I knew so well. "Mon ami, when a man locks himself away to settle old scores and is found dead the next morning, it suggests that someone was most eager to prevent that settling. The locked room, it is merely the stage dressing. The real drama, it lies in the human heart, in greed, in fear, in the desperate desire to keep old secrets buried." He rose and reached for his hat. "Come, Hastings. We go to meet a murderer who believes themselves very clever indeed. It will be most instructive to prove them wrong." The train journey to Surrey passed in contemplative silence, with Poirot sitting motionless, his eyes half closed in that peculiar state of concentration I had learned to recognize. Miss Thornfield gazed from the window at the grey November landscape, her gloved hands clasped tightly in her lap. Only when the train began to slow did my friend stir, adjusting his coat with characteristic precision. "Tell me, mademoiselle," he said as we gathered our belongings, "this paper knife that killed Mr. Blackwood, it belonged to him?" "Yes, part of a silver desk set. He was quite particular about it. No one else was permitted to handle the pieces. He had a habit of using the knife to open correspondence, often with rather theatrical flourishes during dinner conversations." "Ah," murmured Poirot. "So all your dinner companions would have been familiar with this weapon?" "Certainly. Mr. Blackwood made quite a performance of slitting envelopes." The motor car that met us at the station conveyed us through winding lanes to Blackwood Manor, an imposing Georgian structure of dark stone that seemed to brood beneath the lowering sky. As we approached the circular drive, I observed several figures watching from the windows, the remaining members of what Miss Thornfield had called Mr. Blackwood's usual circle. We were met at the door by a tall, spare man whose black coat and dignified bearing marked him as the valet Fletcher, whom Miss Thornfield had mentioned earlier. "Fletcher," she said, "this is Monsieur Hercule Poirot and Captain Hastings. They have come about Mr. Blackwood." The valet's relief was evident. "Thank you, sir. This business has shaken the entire household. Mr. Blackwood was a demanding master, but we understood him. To think that someone could—" He shook his head gravely. "The study," Poirot said without preamble. "It remains exactly as it was found." "Yes, sir. The local constable sealed it after the doctor examined the body. Nothing has been disturbed." Fletcher led us through corridors lined with dark portraits whose eyes seemed to follow our progress. The study door, when we reached it, bore the constable's official seal. At Poirot's request, Fletcher carefully removed it and pushed open the heavy door. The room was spacious but oppressive, lined with legal tomes and business papers. Behind an enormous mahogany desk, a dark stain marked the Persian carpet. The desk itself told the story of violent interruption, scattered papers, an overturned inkwell, and, most significantly, a silver paper knife now lying upon a clean cloth, tagged as evidence. Poirot moved about the room with the delicate precision of a cat, examining everything while touching nothing. He paid particular attention to the 3 tall windows, all latched securely from within, their heavy frames showing no signs of tampering. "Hastings, examine the lock mechanism, if you please." I studied the door carefully. Definitely locked from the inside, Poirot. The key was still in the lock when the door was forced. Précisément. He turned his attention to the massive fireplace, peering up the chimney with his pocket torch before emerging with a slight grimace. As Mademoiselle said, impossible for human passage. His gaze fell upon the desk, where papers lay scattered by the violence. One document immediately caught his attention, a half-finished letter, the ink still wet where it had been interrupted by the overturned inkwell. "My dear solicitor," Poirot read aloud, "I write to inform you of my intention to make immediate and substantial changes to my last will and testament. Recent discoveries have made it clear that those I trusted most have betrayed that trust in the most fundamental ways. I intend to see justice done, regardless of the personal cost. I shall call upon you tomorrow to discuss—" The letter ended there, cut short by death. "Most illuminating," Poirot murmured. Mr. Blackwood's intention to settle old scores was no idle dinner-table threat. Someone in this house knew their secrets were about to be exposed. He completed his circuit of the room, his keen eyes noting every detail. The position of the overturned chair, the angle of the scattered papers, the precise location where violence had occurred. "The locked room, it is indeed puzzling," he said finally. "But as I suspected, it is not the true mystery. The real question, mes amis, is which of our suspects possessed both the desperation to commit murder and the ingenuity to make it appear impossible." Fletcher cleared his throat respectfully. "Shall I inform the others that you wish to see them, sir?" "Indeed," Poirot replied, straightening his coat. "We have examined the stage. Now we must meet the players. Each will attempt to deceive us in their own fashion, and that, I believe, will prove most instructive." As Fletcher departed to summon the household, Poirot remained motionless, his gaze fixed upon the interrupted letter. The game, as he was fond of saying, was afoot. The drawing-room to which Fletcher escorted us was a testament to Blackwood's austere taste, all dark mahogany and heavy velvet draperies that seemed to absorb what little November light filtered through the tall windows. 3 figures awaited us, arranged with the careful distance of people, who no longer trusted one another, each watching our entrance with barely concealed anxiety. Poirot paused on the threshold, allowing his sharp eyes to catalogue every detail of their positions and expressions before making his entrance with that distinctive, almost theatrical precision that never failed to unsettle the guilty. His gaze swept the room methodically, noting the way each person held themselves, the nervous gestures they attempted to suppress, the careful avoidance of direct eye contact between them. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began with a slight bow, his voice carrying that precise Belgian accent. "I am Hercule Poirot, and this is my colleague Captain Hastings. We have come at the request of Miss Thornfield to examine the circumstances surrounding the death of Mr. Cornelius Blackwood." The first to respond was a young man of perhaps 30, whose resemblance to the deceased was unmistakable despite his considerably more pleasant countenance. He rose from his chair with practiced grace, though I detected a slight tremor in his hands as he extended one in greeting. "Gerald Blackwood," he said, his voice a rich baritone carefully modulated with appropriate grief. "Cornelius was my uncle. I understand you're investigating his death as something other than suicide. I confess the idea seems rather Extraordinary. We investigate nothing yet, monsieur, Poirot replied with careful precision. We observe, we listen, and we allow the facts to arrange themselves into their proper order. Tell me, what was your impression of your uncle's state of mind yesterday evening? Gerald's laugh held no humor. Uncle Cornelius was always suspicious, Monsieur Poirot. Last night he seemed particularly agitated, making cryptic remarks about settling accounts and discovering the truth. Frankly, I assumed it was another of his dramatic episodes. A sharp intake of breath from across the room drew our attention to a man of middle years whose expensive tailoring could not quite disguise the nervous energy that seemed to vibrate through his frame. His features were sharp, his gaze shrewd and calculating behind rimless spectacles. "Dramatic episodes?" the man interjected, his voice pitched slightly higher than normal. "Gerald, you do your uncle a disservice. When Cornelius suspected something, he was usually correct." Poirot turned his penetrating gaze upon the speaker. "You are Mr. Edmund Carstairs, I believe, the business partner." "For 15 years, yes. We built the firm into one of London's most successful import businesses. Cornelius was brilliant, though his methods were sometimes unconventional. And this investigation he had been conducting, it concerned business matters." Carstairs shifted uncomfortably, his hands clasping and unclasping behind his back. He'd been questioning certain transactions from years past, examining old contracts and correspondence. I told him repeatedly that such ancient history was best left undisturbed. The third member of our audience, a young woman of perhaps 20 with the fragile beauty of porcelain and eyes that held depths of sadness, spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Uncle Cornelius wasn't being dramatic," said Lucy Fairfax, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles showed white. He was frightened. I could see it in his eyes these past weeks. He'd discovered something terrible. Miss Thornfield, who had entered quietly and taken a position near the window, added with careful control. Mr. Blackwood had become increasingly secretive in recent weeks. He'd begun locking certain files in his private safe and handling much correspondence personally. But I can say with certainty that his concern was genuine, and his fear was real. Poirot nodded slowly, his gaze moving from face to face with the methodical precision of a jeweler examining stones for flaws. "So we have established that Mr. Blackwood was conducting some form of investigation that caused him considerable distress. Yesterday, he spoke of settling accounts. Last night, he locked himself away to act upon his discoveries. This morning, he is dead." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle upon the room like a shroud. "In such circumstances, mes amis, the English police speak of locked doors and impossible crimes. Hercule Poirot thinks instead of human nature, of fear, of desperation, of the lengths to which people will go when their secrets are threatened with exposure." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the soft whisper of rain against the windows and the nervous rustle of Lucy's handkerchief. "I shall require detailed statements from each of you," Poirot announced, his voice carrying quiet authority. "Every word spoken yesterday, every gesture observed, every moment accounted for. We shall begin with individual interviews, for I have found that people are often more forthcoming when they believe themselves unobserved by their companions." His eyes flickered from face to face, and I saw each person stiffen slightly under his scrutiny. "The murderer among you," he continued softly, "will find it increasingly difficult to maintain their deception. For lies, mes amis, have a way of multiplying, and with each multiplication, they become more tangled, more contradictory, more impossible to sustain." He straightened his waistcoat with characteristic precision. "Fletcher, perhaps you would show Mr. Gerald Blackwood to the morning room. We shall begin with him." The morning room, with its pale yellow walls and cheerful furnishings, provided a welcome contrast to the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to permeate the rest of Blackwood Manor. Gerald Blackwood entered with the practiced composure of a man accustomed to social situations, though I noticed immediately the way his fingers drummed a nervous tattoo against his leg as he settled into the chair opposite Poirot. My friend regarded him with those penetrating, grey eyes that seemed to see straight through to a man's soul, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough to become uncomfortable before speaking. "You must understand, monsieur, that in matters of this gravity, precision is essential. Every detail, however seemingly insignificant, may prove crucial to our understanding." Gerald nodded, though his composure wavered slightly. "Of course, Monsieur Poirot, though I confess I cannot see how Uncle Cornelius could have been murdered in a locked room. The whole thing seems impossible." "Ah, but impossibility is merely another word for a truth we have not yet grasped," Poirot replied smoothly. "Now, tell me about your relationship with your uncle. You are his principal heir, I believe." A flush crept up Gerald's neck, and his drumming fingers stilled. "So I have always been given to understand, though Uncle Cornelius delighted in reminding me that such arrangements could change at his whim. He controlled every aspect of our lives through his will, Monsieur Poirot. It was not a comfortable position for a man of my age. Yet you remained dependent upon his goodwill. This must have been trying." Gerald's laugh held a bitter edge. "Uncle Cornelius made it clear that any attempt at independence would result in immediate disinheritance. He enjoyed the power it gave him over us all." Poirot leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on that deceptively gentle tone I knew so well. "And yesterday evening, when he spoke of making changes to his will, this concerned you greatly." "Everything Uncle Cornelius said concerned me," Gerald admitted, his carefully maintained facade beginning to crack. "But particularly of late, he had been questioning certain financial arrangements of mine." "Debts, monsieur?" Gerald shifted uncomfortably. "Racing accounts, some bridge losses, and other private obligations. Nothing scandalous, but Uncle had somehow discovered the full extent of them. He threatened to cut me off entirely if I didn't mend my profligate ways, as he put it." "A serious threat to a man in your circumstances," Poirot observed quietly. "Serious enough," Gerald replied, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. He seemed to take particular pleasure in my discomfort, hinting that he had discovered other things as well. Things that would shock us all, as he put it. Poirot made a note in his small leather notebook. "And your movements after your uncle retired to his study last evening?" "I remained in the drawing room until approximately 11 o'clock, then went to my room. I read until quite late. I'm a poor sleeper, I'm afraid. I heard nothing unusual during the night." When Gerald had been dismissed, looking considerably shaken, Poirot turned his attention to Edmund Carstairs, who entered with the brisk efficiency of a businessman, though the same underlying nervousness marked his demeanour. "Monsieur Poirot," Carstairs began without preamble, "I hope you can resolve this matter quickly. The uncertainty is terrible for business confidence." "Naturellement? Tell me about these old transactions that so troubled Mr. Blackwood." Carstairs' jaw tightened. Cornelius had become obsessed with contracts from our early years, deals that were perfectly legitimate but perhaps not documented with today's precision. He seemed convinced that someone had been systematically defrauding the company. And had they? Poirot's question was delivered with studied neutrality. "Absolutely not." The vehemence of Carstairs' response was telling. "Every transaction was properly authorized. If the paperwork seems irregular by current standards, it's simply because business practices were different 15 years ago. But Cornelius wouldn't let it rest. He threatened to expose everything which would have destroyed our reputation." "Your movements after dinner, monsieur?" "I went to the library to review some contracts. I wanted to prepare responses to Cornelius's accusations. I worked there until nearly 2 o'clock. The library is near the study. Adjacent to it, actually. But I heard nothing unusual." As Carstairs departed, Poirot sat in contemplative silence, his fingertips pressed together in that characteristic gesture. "2 men, Hastings," he said finally, each claiming to have been alone during the crucial hours, each with compelling reasons to fear Mr. Blackwood's discoveries. The pattern begins to emerge, but we must hear from all our players before the picture becomes clear. He rose with his usual precision. Come, let us continue. The truth, she is there waiting to be uncovered, but first we must strip away all the layers of deception that surround her. Lucy Fairfax entered the morning room with the hesitant grace of a deer approaching water, her pale hands trembling slightly as she arranged her black morning dress. The fragile beauty I had observed earlier seemed even more pronounced in the intimate setting, yet there was something in her dark eyes, a watchfulness that spoke of intelligence carefully concealed beneath an exterior of feminine delicacy. Poirot's manner became noticeably gentler as he regarded the young woman, his voice taking on that paternal tone he reserved for those he sensed were genuinely vulnerable. Mademoiselle Fairfax, I understand this has been most distressing for you. Mr. Blackwood was your guardian since childhood, n'est-ce pas? Since I was 12, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. My parents died in a carriage accident, and Uncle Cornelius, though he wasn't truly my uncle, took me in. He was kind to me, in his way, though not demonstrative. He provided for everything I needed, but lately he had become almost protective. In what manner, mademoiselle? Lucy's hands twisted the handkerchief in her lap. He had begun questioning my friendships, my correspondence. He seemed convinced that people were attempting to use me to gain access to his fortune. Perhaps he was right. To be suspicious. Poirot leaned forward slightly. You speak as though you witnessed something specific yesterday evening. Lucy's composure wavered, and for a moment I saw the frightened child she must once have been. There is something I must tell you, Monsieur Poirot, though I fear you will think me terribly improper. I think nothing except that truth is essential, mademoiselle. She drew a shaky breath. There is a small panel in the passage outside Uncle's study, part of the old servant bell system. The inspection slit can be opened if one knows where to press. As a child, I sometimes watched Uncle work through it. Last night, after he retired to his study, I was so frightened about what he might do, whom he might disinherit, what scandal he might create, that I went to look. Poirot's eyes gleamed with interest. And what did you observe? Uncle at his desk, writing furiously. He looked driven, almost wild. He kept consulting a bundle of old papers and twice went to his safe for more documents. At one point he laughed, a horrible sound, and said aloud, "That will settle you, my friend." I watched for perhaps 15 minutes until I heard footsteps approaching from the main corridor. Someone else was coming to the study. A man's step, I believe. I closed the panel quickly and slipped back to my room. I never saw who it was, but I was terrified Uncle might catch me spying. And the time, mademoiselle? It must have been near 10:30. From my window I could see the light in Uncle's study until well past midnight, much later than usual for him to work when agitated. When Lucy departed, looking both relieved and exhausted by her confession, Poirot remained thoughtful for several minutes before summoning Miss Thornfield. The secretary entered with her characteristic composed efficiency, though new lines of strain marked her features. She settled herself with the practiced grace of one accustomed to formal interviews. Miss Thornfield, Poirot began, you have served as Mr. Blackwood's confidential secretary for some time. In recent weeks, what changes did you observe in his behavior? Mr. Blackwood had always been meticulous, but lately he became almost obsessive, she replied with professional precision. He ordered all the old Blackwood and Carstairs files from storage. Documents from 10, 15, even 20 years past. He spent hours examining shipping records and correspondence, increasingly preferring to work alone and locking certain papers in his private safe. Did he confide the nature of his suspicions? Not directly, but he muttered often enough about fraud on a grand scale and parasites feeding on what I built. Once I heard him say, I shall tear the mask from every one of them. He seemed to believe that multiple people had been deceiving him. And yesterday evening, He seemed almost triumphant, as though he had finally obtained proof of something long suspected. He spent considerable time reviewing files and making notes in a private journal he always kept locked in his desk drawer. Poirot's attention sharpened. This journal, it was found with the body. Miss Thornfield shook her head gravely. That troubles me most, Monsieur Poirot. The journal has vanished. Uncle Cornelius never went anywhere without it, yet it was nowhere in the study. Someone took it. Most illuminating. Now, you are familiar with all parts of this house. The sliding panel in the passage outside the study. You know of it? Just for a moment, her composure flickered. Yes, part of the old bell system. It provides a view into the study. Mr. Blackwood had forgotten its existence years ago. You have used it yourself? Occasionally, when he was in a particularly foul temper. It was safer to gauge his mood before entering. Her chin lifted slightly. But not last night. I had no wish to witness Mr. Blackwood at his most vindictive. Your movements after dinner. I remained in the drawing room until Mr. Blackwood retired, then sorted the late post in my room. I retired at 11:30 and heard nothing unusual during the night. When Miss Thornfield had departed, Poirot sat in contemplative silence, his fingertips pressed together in that characteristic gesture. You observe, Hastings, he said finally, how the picture grows clearer yet more complex. We now know that Mr. Blackwood was alive and working alone for some time after locking himself in. Someone approached the study while he worked, someone whose identity our timid Miss Lucy fears to guess. Most significantly, a journal containing his private suspicions has vanished. It seems to point toward premeditated murder, I ventured. Someone who knew exactly what evidence needed to be destroyed. Précisément. And now we have 4 people, each with compelling motives, each claiming to have been alone during the crucial hours. But one of them lies, mon ami, and that lie, combined with a missing journal and a most convenient sliding panel, will prove to be their undoing. He rose with characteristic precision. Come, we must examine this panel for ourselves. The truth she hides in the details that others overlook, and I suspect our murderer made one crucial error. They assumed no one else knew of their secret observation post. The game, as Poirot was fond of saying, was indeed afoot, and the locked room was beginning to yield its secrets to his methodical investigation. The passage outside Blackwood's study was narrow and dimly lit, lined with portraits whose painted eyes seemed to follow our movements with silent judgment. Poirot moved along the wall with methodical precision, his fingers probing the ancient paneling until he found the section Lucy Fairfax had described, a small panel that yielded to gentle pressure with the faintest whisper of well-oiled hinges. The inspection slit revealed an excellent view of the study's interior, particularly the massive desk where Blackwood had met his end. From this vantage point, an observer could monitor every movement within the room while remaining completely concealed. Ingenious for its original purpose, Poirot murmured, examining the edges with his magnifying glass. But observe, Hastings, these worn spots where fingers have repeatedly pressed. This panel has seen far more use than Miss Fairfax's occasional childhood spying would account for. He continued his examination with characteristic thoroughness and presently made a small sound of satisfaction. Clinging to a splinter of the old wood was a single strand of dark blue fabric, fine wool of excellent quality. More significantly, the faint but unmistakable aroma of expensive pipe tobacco lingered in the narrow space. The same tobacco scent I noticed on Gerald Blackwood's clothing, I observed, the implications becoming clear. Précisément. Someone wearing a gentleman's fine wool suit and smoking a particular blend of tobacco spent considerable time at this observation post. The question remains, when and what did they witness? Before I could respond, Fletcher appeared at the end of the corridor, his usually composed features betraying obvious distress. Monsieur Poirot, he began formally, Constable Reeves has returned from the village with urgent news. The constable who followed Fletcher bore an expression of harassed bewilderment that spoke of complications beyond his usual experience. "Sir," Reeves began, touching his helmet respectfully, "we've found an abandoned motorcar by the old quarry road, dark blue Austin registered to a Mr. Henry Vale. The gentleman was lodging at the Hare and Hound, came 3 days ago on business, never returned last night." Poirot's eyes sharpened with interest. "And this Mr. Vale, what manner of business brought him to the area?" "That's just it, sir. We found papers in the car, letters addressed to Mr. Blackwood, never posted, signed by Vale, and a telegram draft that reads, 'Have obtained documentary proof. Meeting as arranged. Will deliver tonight without fail.'" The pieces of the puzzle began arranging themselves in my mind. "The final confirmation mentioned in Blackwood's diary," I said. "Just so, Hastings. Our mysterious correspondent has been found. Or rather, not found." Poirot's voice carried that quiet intensity I knew so well. "You will permit me to examine these letters, Constable." The documents told a damning story of falsified shipping manifests, fraudulent invoices, and systematic theft spanning years. Vale appeared to have been a clerk or minor employee who had discovered the deception and sought to expose it through Blackwood. "Most illuminating," Poirot said, returning the papers. "Continue your search of the quarry, Constable, but say nothing to the household about Mr. Vale just yet. When murderers believe their secrets are safe, they grow careless." After Reeves departed, Poirot requested an interview with Fletcher in the morning. Room. The valet entered with visible reluctance, his professional composure showing distinct cracks. 23 years of faithful service. Fletcher began unprompted, as though defending himself against unspoken accusations. "Mr. Blackwood was demanding, but I never betrayed his trust." "Yet someone did," Poirot observed gently. "Someone with intimate knowledge of his habits, his suspicions, his recent discoveries. Tell me about the observation panel, Fletcher. You knew of its existence." Fletcher's hands clasped behind his back in a defensive gesture. "All the senior staff knew of it, sir, part of the old Bell system. But I would never have used it to spy on my master." "Non. Yet someone made regular use of it. Someone who needed to monitor Mr. Blackwood's activities closely, perhaps to stay one step ahead of his growing suspicions." The valet's composure cracked entirely. "I know nothing about any spying. My loyalty was absolute." "But loyalty to whom, Fletcher?" Poirot's voice carried quiet authority. "To Mr. Blackwood, or to someone else whose secrets you helped protect." When Fletcher departed, thoroughly shaken, Poirot remained deep in thought. "The pattern emerges, Hastings," he said finally. "Fraud in the business, discovered by Vale. Vale contacts Blackwood with proof. Blackwood plans to expose the guilty parties and alter his will accordingly. But someone in this house knew of these developments. Someone who could monitor Blackwood's activities and who understood exactly what evidence needed to be destroyed." He rose with characteristic precision. "Tomorrow, mon ami, we shall gather all our players for the final act." The locked room was merely theatrical dressing. The real crime lies in the human heart, in greed, fear, and the desperate desire to keep old secrets buried. The afternoon light was fading as storm clouds gathered over Blackwood Manor, and I sensed that the approaching darkness would bring revelations that would shock us all. That evening, the atmosphere at Blackwood Manor had grown thick with unspoken suspicions and barely controlled fear. The discovery of Henry Vale's body at the bottom of the old quarry had transformed what might have been considered an isolated tragedy into something far more sinister, a calculated double murder that spoke of desperation and ruthless determination. Poirot sat in the drawing room after our subdued dinner, his fingers steepled in that characteristic gesture of deep contemplation. The household had received the news of Vale's death with reactions that ranged from shock to carefully controlled composure, but my friend's penetrating gaze had missed nothing of their responses. "The human heart, Hastings," he observed quietly, "reveals itself most clearly in moments of crisis. Our murderer has now killed twice, once to silence the man who possessed damning evidence, and once to eliminate the witness who could expose the fraud. But in doing so, they have revealed the true scope of their desperation. Gerald Blackwood paced restlessly near the window, his earlier nervous energy now replaced by something approaching panic. This changes everything, doesn't it, Monsieur Poirot? If this Vale fellow was murdered, then surely his death and uncle's are connected. Some outside party must be responsible. On the contrary, monsieur, Poirot replied with quiet authority. The connection between these deaths points not to an outsider, but to someone with intimate knowledge of your uncle's habits, his investigation, and his growing suspicions. Someone who knew exactly what evidence needed to be destroyed and which witnesses silenced. Edmund Carstairs, who had been unusually silent throughout the evening, finally spoke from his position near the fireplace. "You're suggesting that someone in this house committed both murders? That's a serious accusation, Monsieur Poirot." "I suggest nothing, monsieur. I observe facts and allow them to arrange themselves into their proper pattern. The facts tell us that Vale was killed between 9 and 11 last evening, precisely when our murderer claims to have been alone. The facts tell us that Blackwood's private journal, containing his documented suspicions, has vanished. The facts tell us that someone had been systematically observing Blackwood through that convenient panel, monitoring his every move." Miss Thornfield shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "But surely the locked room proves that Uncle Cornelius died by his own hand. How else could the door have been secured from within?" Poirot's eyes gleamed with that particular intensity I had learned to recognize. "Ah, mademoiselle, but you assume that the locked door tells us when the murder occurred. What if, instead, it tells us something entirely different?" He rose and moved to the center of the room, commanding everyone's attention with his presence. "Consider this possibility, mes amis. What if the locked room was not the scene of the crime, but merely the final stage of an elaborate deception? What if Mr. Blackwood was killed elsewhere in this house, and his body positioned in the study to create the illusion of suicide?" Lucy Fairfax gasped softly. "But that would mean someone had access to the study after Uncle locked himself in. How could that be possible?" "An excellent question, mademoiselle, and one that our murderer hoped no one would think to ask." Poirot's smile was enigmatic. "But I have discovered something most illuminating during my examination of this house. There is a second entrance to the study, one that has been forgotten by everyone except the person who used it to commit murder." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the soft whisper of rain against the windows. I could see the fear growing in each face as the implications of Poirot's words settled upon them. "Tomorrow morning," Poirot announced with quiet finality, "I shall gather you all in the study and demonstrate exactly how these impossible crimes were committed. I shall reveal who killed both Cornelius Blackwood and Henry Vale, and why. The locked room mystery that seemed so impenetrable will prove to be nothing more than a clever illusion, one that nearly succeeded in concealing the truth." He moved toward the door, then paused, his gaze sweeping the room one final time. "I suggest you all retire early and reflect upon your actions. For one among you knows that their carefully constructed deception is about to crumble, and that justice, so long delayed, is finally at hand." As the household dispersed with obvious reluctance, each person lost in their own dark thoughts, I couldn't help but feel that the storm brewing outside was nothing compared to the tempest of revelation that tomorrow would bring. The game was approaching its climax, and Hercule Poirot was ready to expose the truth that lay hidden beneath layers of deception and murder. Sleep did not come easily to me that night. The wind worried at the ancient stone of Blackwood Manor, rattling the window panes and setting odd creaks running through the house. I lay awake, turning Poirot's words over in my mind about second entrances and bodies moved, about locked rooms that were not what they pretended to be. When I finally rose with the grey dawn light, I found Poirot already dressed and examining a set of architectural drawings he had obtained from Fletcher during the early hours. His small, egg-shaped head was tilted in that characteristic pose of intense concentration. "Ah, Hastings," he greeted me with unusual animation. "These plans from 1847 reveal most illuminating details about the original construction. But first, we must speak again with Fletcher. There is something he omitted from his account yesterday." We found the valet in the breakfast room, his usually impassive face drawn and pale. At Poirot's quiet request, he followed us to the small side parlor. "Fletcher," Poirot began without preamble, "when Mr. Blackwood retired to his study, what precisely did you do afterward?" "I went to my pantry to polish the silver, as I always do after dinner," Fletcher replied, clearly struggling to maintain his composure. "Yet you omitted one detail yesterday, the coffee tray you prepared at 10:30. Fletcher started visibly. "How did you—" "The kitchen maid Emily remembered your irritation when you discovered Miss Thornfield had not ordered the usual late coffee. You decided to prepare it yourself, as the master would expect it. You carried it to the study door. What happened then?" The color drained from Fletcher's face. "I knocked softly, as I always did." There was no answer. I assumed he hadn't heard, so I knocked again. Still nothing, though the light was on under the door. I tried the handle. It was locked. "That's why I didn't mention it, sir. It seemed odd, and with what happened afterward, I feared suspicion would fall on me." So at 10:30, the light was burning, the doctor was locked, yet Mr. Blackwood did not answer, Poirot mused. Already, something was very wrong indeed. After dismissing Fletcher, Poirot led me back to the study with purposeful strides. The morning light revealed details that had been obscured in yesterday's gloom, and my friend moved about the room with the methodical precision of a surgeon. "Observe, Hastings," he said, approaching the wall dominated by the towering bookshelf. "The human eye, it perceives what it expects to perceive and dismisses what it does not understand." He ran his fingers along the wooden frame, tracing lines that were almost invisible to casual observation. "The grain here, and this slight discoloration. A faint seam runs vertically, and another horizontally, just above the skirting board." Producing his silver-tipped cane, he tapped gently along these nearly imperceptible lines. The sound was subtly different in one section, a hollow thud where solid wood should have been. "This is not a solid wall, mon ami. This is a door, a very old, very cleverly concealed door." With careful pressure applied to a specific point, a section of the bookshelf, complete with books, swung inward with the faintest whisper of well-oiled hinges. Beyond lay a narrow, dust-filled passage that disappeared into darkness. Voila! A secret passage, part of the original servants' corridors leading to the library next door, the murderer's highway hidden in plain sight for decades. The stale air that wafted from the passage carried the scent of damp earth and long disuse, but the dust patterns on the floor showed recent disturbance, footprints that had been carefully but not completely obscured. Someone with intimate knowledge of this house discovered this passage and realized its potential, Poirot continued, examining the hidden door's mechanism. They could enter the study undetected, commit their crime, and retreat, leaving the main door locked from within. A perfect locked room mystery. Before leaving the study, Poirot requested Miss Thornfield to open Blackwood's private safe. Her reluctant compliance revealed not only the expected legal documents and valuables, but also a slim black notebook bound in Morocco leather. "The private journal," I breathed. "Exactly. But observe, Hastings, between the final pages, carbon paper. Mr. Blackwood, suspicious man that he was, made duplicate copies of his most sensitive entries. When the murderer stole what they believed was the only record of his discoveries, they overlooked these copies hidden in the safe." Poirot skimmed several pages, his eyebrows rising at the documented evidence of systematic fraud, before closing the journal with satisfaction. "The picture is now complete, mon ami. We have the method, the motive, and the evidence. It remains only to gather our players for the final act." He straightened his waistcoat with characteristic precision. "At 10 o'clock, we shall assemble everyone in this room. The murderer believes their secret passage and stolen journal have secured their safety. They are about to discover how thoroughly they have deceived themselves." The morning light was strengthening as storm clouds gathered over Blackwood Manor, and I sensed that the approaching drama would finally expose the truth that had been so carefully hidden beneath layers of deception and murder. At precisely 10 o'clock, the study had transformed into a theatre of justice, its oppressive atmosphere charged with the electric tension of approaching revelation. Poirot had arranged the chairs with characteristic precision, creating an intimate semicircle where every expression, every nervous gesture, every betraying movement would be visible to all assembled. Gerald Blackwood sat rigidly upright, his usual polish dulled by strain and fear, hands gripping his chair arms with white-knuckled intensity. Edmund Carstairs had positioned himself near the window as though seeking escape, his shrewd eyes darting nervously about the room while his fingers worried at his watch chain. Lucy Fairfax trembled in her seat like a frightened bird, her enormous eyes fixed on Poirot with desperate hope, while Miss Thornfield maintained her professional composure near the desk, though I noticed the slight tremor in her carefully controlled hands. Fletcher stood against the wall, his usual dignity intact, despite recent events, and Constable Reeves occupied a chair by the entrance, notebook ready to record whatever revelations were to come. The secret passage remained conspicuously open, its dark mouth serving as a silent reminder of the deception that had made these crimes possible. Poirot stood before this assembled company with that theatrical presence that transformed him from a mild-mannered Belgian gentleman into an instrument of inexorable justice. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, his voice carrying quiet authority that commanded absolute attention, "we are gathered to solve a puzzle that appeared impossible. 2 murders committed by someone who seemed to have no opportunity in circumstances that appeared to preclude human intervention. The locked room mystery that has so puzzled the local authorities will prove to be nothing more than elaborate stage dressing designed to conceal a truth far more sinister." He moved to stand beside Blackwood's desk, his presence radiating that peculiar intensity I had learned to recognize when his little grey cells had arranged all the pieces of a complex puzzle. "Let us begin with the facts as they appeared. Cornelius Blackwood locked himself in this study at 10 o'clock on the evening of his death. The door remained locked from within, the windows secured, the chimney too narrow for passage. Yet the next morning he was found dead by violence. Murdered, though no one could have entered or left the room." Gerald shifted uncomfortably. "But surely that proves suicide, Monsieur Poirot. How else could—" "Non, monsieur. It proves only that someone wished us to believe in suicide. But when the obvious explanation defies logic, one must look deeper." Poirot gestured toward the open secret passage with theatrical precision. "Behold the solution to our impossible crime. A hidden entrance, part of the original servant corridors, provided access to the study even when the main door was locked." He produced the carbon copy pages from Blackwood's journal, holding them where all could see. Mr. Blackwood had discovered systematic fraud in his business, falsified shipping manifests, inflated invoices, diverted profits. For 15 years, someone had been stealing from him with methodical precision. When Henry Vale contacted him with documentary proof, Mr. Blackwood knew he finally had the evidence needed to expose the guilty party. Carstairs sprang to his feet, color flooding his face. "This is outrageous. There's no proof of any—" "On the contrary, monsieur, there is abundant proof." Poirot's voice cut across the protest like steel. "You believed that by stealing the visible journal from this desk after the murder, you had destroyed the only record of your guilt. But you underestimated Mr. Blackwood's caution. He kept carbon copies of his most sensitive entries locked in his safe." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by Lucy's sharp intake of breath and the soft whisper of rain against the windows. Here, in his own hand, he traces the fraudulent transactions. Dummy accounts, falsified invoices, diverted payments. Each trail leads inexorably to one man, you, Monsieur Edmond Carstairs. You knew Vale was coming with corroborating evidence. You intercepted him on the quarry road, murdered him, and disposed of his body. Then you returned here to complete your work. Poirot's gaze fixed unwaveringly on Carstairs, whose face had gone ashen. You used the secret passage you had discovered during your years working in the adjacent library. You entered the study while Mr. Blackwood was absorbed in documenting your crimes, struck him down with his own paper knife, then arranged the scene to suggest suicide. "You're building castles on speculation," Carstairs said hoarsely, though his composure was cracking visibly. "Any of us might have known about that passage." "No, monsieur. Only you had the intimate knowledge of this house's layout from cataloguing the library, the financial desperation that exposure would bring, and the direct connection to the fraudulent transactions Vale had threatened to expose. The scent of your particular tobacco near the observation panel, the blue wool fiber caught on the secret door's edge. These are not coincidences." Poirot's eyes gleamed with that quiet triumph I knew so well. "But most damning of all, you overlooked one crucial witness, someone who saw you enter the library that night, someone who can place you here during the crucial hours when you claimed to be alone." His gaze moved, very deliberately, to Miss Thornfield, whose composed facade finally cracked as she met his penetrating stare. "N'est-ce pas, mademoiselle?" Poirot said softly. "You have something to tell us about Mr. Carstairs' movements that evening." The room held its collective breath as Diana Thornfield's fingers tightened on her chair, her professional mask slipping to reveal the weight of terrible knowledge she had carried alone. Miss Thornfield's composed facade crumbled entirely under Poirot's penetrating gaze, her carefully maintained professional demeanor giving way to the terrible burden she had carried through the long night. Her hands trembled as she pressed them to her lips, and when she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I saw him," she said, the words seeming to tear from her throat. "I saw Mr. Carstairs in the library at 10:30, but not working on contracts as he claimed. He was examining the bookshelf, the same section you've just revealed as the secret passage. When he found the mechanism and the panel swung open, I understood what I was witnessing." Carstairs lunged toward her with desperate fury. "You lying witch! You can't prove—" "Silence!" Poirot's command cracked like a whip, and Constable Reeves moved swiftly to restrain the increasingly frantic man. "Let Mademoiselle finish her account." Miss Thornfield drew a shuddering breath, her professional composure finally returning as the weight of secrecy lifted from her shoulders. "I was returning late correspondence to the files when I heard footsteps in the library. Through the connecting door, I saw Mr. Carstairs disappear into that passage for what felt like an eternity. When he emerged, he was changed, wild-eyed, breathing heavily, his shirt stained with something dark. He carried what looked like Mr. Blackwood's journal wrapped in cloth, along with other papers." "And you said nothing?" Gerald demanded, his voice sharp with accusation. "What could I say? I was terrified. I convinced myself there must be some innocent explanation, but when we found Uncle Cornelius dead the next morning, I knew the truth." Poirot nodded with quiet satisfaction, producing a small evidence bag containing fragments of charred paper. "Your testimony confirms what the physical evidence has already told us. These were recovered from the library fireplace, where you attempted to burn Vale's documents after the murder, Monsieur Carstairs. The fire was insufficient to destroy them completely. Bank records, shipping manifests, correspondence, all bearing your signature, all documenting 15 years of systematic theft." He consulted the carbon pages from Blackwood's journal with methodical precision. "Falsified shipping records, inflated invoices, dummy companies created to siphon profits. You discovered the secret passage during your years in the library and realized it provided perfect access to Blackwood's private study. When Vale contacted your partner with evidence of your crimes, you knew exposure was imminent. The room fell silent except for the soft patter of rain against the windows and Carstairs' increasingly labored breathing. The weight of evidence had crushed his defiance, leaving only a hollow shell of the confident businessman who had entered this room an hour earlier. "You killed Vale on the quarry road when he arrived with his damning evidence," Poirot continued with inexorable logic. "You disposed of his body, then returned here to silence the only other person who could expose you. Using the secret passage, you entered the study while Blackwood worked on his journal. You struck him down with his own paper knife, arranged the scene to suggest suicide, then retreated through your hidden route, leaving the main door locked from within." "It should have worked," Carstairs said suddenly, his voice hollow with defeat. "The locked room, the apparent suicide, it should have ended the investigation before it began. But you underestimated human nature, monsieur. You assumed fear would keep witnesses silent, that destroyed evidence could not be recovered, that a perfect crime required only perfect planning. You forgot that guilt leaves traces that cannot be erased, and that truth has a way of surfacing despite our best efforts to bury it." Constable Reeves stepped forward with his handcuffs as Carstairs slumped in his chair, the fight finally gone out of him. "Edmund Carstairs, I arrest you for the murders of Cornelius Blackwood and Henry Vale." As the constable led away the broken man, the oppressive atmosphere of the study seemed to lift, as though the truth itself had exorcised the shadows that had haunted Blackwood Manor. Gerald passed a hand over his brow as though waking from a nightmare. So it was Carstairs all along. Uncle suspected in the end. He always said betrayal came from those closest to us. Lucy, who had been trembling throughout the revelation, finally spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "What will become of us now, Monsieur Poirot?" "That, mademoiselle," he replied, his tone softening with characteristic gentleness, "depends not on me, but on what each of you chooses to do with the freedom that remains. The shadows have been lifted. It is for you to decide how to live in the light." He straightened his waistcoat with that familiar, meticulous gesture and surveyed the room one final time. The great desk, the secret passage now meaningless, the locked door that had concealed such terrible secrets. "Come, Hastings," he said quietly. "Our work here is finished. The little grey cells may rest for a time. We leave Blackwood Manor to its rightful owners, and to the future they will choose to build, now that the past has been laid bare." As we stepped into the corridor, Poirot paused, casting one last thoughtful glance back at the study where justice had finally been served. "Human nature, mon ami," he murmured, almost to himself. "There lies the eternal tragedy. A man believes himself wronged, and in seeking what he calls justice, he commits acts that cry out for true justice in turn. But the truth, she has a way of emerging, no matter how cleverly we attempt to bury her." He adjusted his cuffs with delicate satisfaction. The locked room was merely stage dressing, Hastings. The real mystery lay in the human heart, in greed, in fear, and in the desperate lengths to which people will go when their secrets are threatened with exposure. The game, as he was fond of saying, was finally concluded. The immediate silence following Carstairs' removal was profound, broken only by the soft whisper of rain against the windows and the collective exhale of those who had lived under suspicion's shadow. Gerald Blackwood was the first to speak, his voice carrying a mixture of relief and lingering shock. "So it was Carstairs all along," he said, passing a trembling hand over his brow. 15 years of systematic theft, and Uncle Cornelius suspected nothing until the end. To think I feared my own guilt would be exposed when the real criminal sat at our dinner table, planning murder. Lucy Fairfax, her fragile composure finally returning, looked toward Poirot with eyes that held the first glimmer of hope she had shown since our arrival. "What becomes of us now, Monsieur Poirot? The estate, the business, everything Uncle Cornelius built?" "That, mademoiselle," Poirot replied gently, "depends upon the courts and the executors, but I suspect your guardian's original intentions before Carstairs' betrayal poisoned his judgment will be honored. You and Gerald are the rightful heirs to what remains after the stolen assets are recovered. Before anyone could respond further, the sound of a motor car in the drive announced another arrival. Fletcher appeared moments later, his professional composure restored, to announce Inspector Japp of Scotland Yard. Japp entered with his characteristic brisk efficiency, water dripping from his coat and his sharp eyes taking in the scene immediately. "There you are, Poirot. I might have known I'd find you in the middle of this locked-room business. 2 murders and an impossible crime. Quite the puzzle for the local force." "But happily resolved, mon cher Japp," Poirot replied with satisfaction. "You arrive precisely in time to collect the murderer and the evidence, all properly arranged for your convenience." "Don't tell me. You've solved it already." Japp's eyebrows rose skeptically. "Well, who's the villain then?" "Edmund Carstairs, the business partner. Reeves has taken him into custody. You will find documentary evidence of 15 years of systematic fraud, along with proof of his access to the study through a forgotten secret passage. The locked room was merely theatrical staging." As Japp departed to handle the official formalities, muttering about conjuring tricks and hidden doors, Poirot took his leave of the household with characteristic ceremony. Miss Thornfield approached him with quiet dignity. "You have given us back the truth, Monsieur Poirot. I failed Mr. Blackwood when he was alive by remaining silent about my suspicions. I could not fail him again. Truth, mademoiselle, requires courage to speak and wisdom to recognize. You possessed both when they were needed most." Gerald stepped forward, looking older but somehow more solid than when we had first met him. "I intend to run the business honestly, Monsieur Poirot, in Uncle Cornelius's name. Perhaps some good can come from this tragedy." "See that you do, monsieur. You have witnessed how small compromises can grow into great crimes. Remember that the line between weakness and wickedness is not always as wide as we prefer to believe." The train journey back to London provided the contemplative atmosphere that Poirot required after such cases. As the Surrey countryside rolled past in shades of grey and brown, he sat with his characteristic precision, hands folded over his walking stick, his expression thoughtful. "You seem melancholy, Poirot," I observed. "Not melancholy, mon ami, but reflective. We have seen again how human nature reveals itself under pressure. Carstairs was not born a murderer. He became one through a series of choices, each seeming small, each leading inexorably to the next. He gazed out at the passing landscape with that peculiar intensity that marked his deepest thoughts. The locked room mystery was ingenious in its simplicity. Carstairs understood that the human mind, faced with apparent impossibility, will accept the unlikely rather than question fundamental assumptions. A suicide in a locked room seemed more believable than murder by impossible means. Yet you saw through the deception. Because I understood that when the obvious explanation defies logic, one must look beyond the obvious. The secret passage was always there, waiting for someone with sufficient patience to discover it. But more importantly, the psychology was wrong. Cornelius Blackwood, proud and vindictive, on the verge of exposing great frauds. Such a man does not choose that moment for suicide. As our familiar Baker Street came into view, Poirot straightened his waistcoat with that gesture of satisfaction I knew so well. The locked room was never truly locked, Hastings. It was merely a prison of deception, constructed by a man who believed himself cleverer than justice itself. But truth, mon ami, has a way of finding the hidden passages, of illuminating the darkest corners, of revealing what we would prefer to keep concealed. He rose as the train slowed, his hat at the precise angle, his mustaches immaculate. Come, another case concludes. Another mystery yields its secrets to patient observation and logical deduction. The little grey cells have served their purpose once again, and somewhere in London, perhaps another puzzle awaits Hercule Poirot. The case of the man who locked himself in and still died was finally, definitively closed.